at the end of class today, I'll give you your media quizzes back. They're not listed on the interactive syllabus yet, but I have... All of a sudden, I thought I was Regis being interrupted by Kathy Lee. So, no, but they will be listed later on today. But all of you who turned in media quizzes have received due credit. And by the way, those of you who gave me more information for the media quiz items, I'll keep that in consideration at the end of the semester. But to me, where you really want to put a lot of that analysis and depth of information would be whenever you take the exam, particularly when it comes to answering the essay questions or when it comes to answering the short answers. That's where sometimes people get a little bit backed up on time. Now keep in mind that the exam worth 50 points, anywhere from 20 to 25 points of that is going to consist of short answers and essays. The first 15 items, as I recall from the past, have been those identification terms. Don't feel like you have to take a long time working on those. And I want to try to signpost this 12 days in advance so there's absolutely no misunderstanding, because occasionally people will obsess on an identification item or a true, false, or a multiple choice on either exam 1 or 3 and don't take enough time to work on the essay or the short answer. So if you feel like there is something in the blue book that warrants extra attention, like a short answer or an essay, go ahead and answer those first. You don't have to answer everything in chronological order. And when it comes time for the exam in 12 days, I'll make sure that I'm here probably a couple of minutes before the hour so you can start. Now, the advantage is, I realize some of you probably have a 12:10 class, but if you're still working past 11:50, you can work all the way to noon, because we intentionally schedule this class at this time primarily for examination purposes, because we have that 20-minute buffer ending at 11:50 and the next class starting at 12:10. So just keep that in mind. We also have, on Wednesday of next week, the term papers coming up. Now, oftentimes at the beginning of the school year, there is a terrible malady that goes around campus called the term paper flu. And I don't want that to envelop any of you. It's a terrible thing where the dog ate your homework or something, but I wanted to try to give you notice far in advance when everything was due, so whenever it comes time for class, you have everything, we can talk about it, and I can take the rest of the 5 days from Wednesday until the following Monday to read them and give them to you ASAP. Because I really want to try to be diligent in getting everything back to you as soon as possible. That's one reason why with exams and with term papers, I'll take from Wednesday until Monday to look at them, and with the media quizzes, I can get those done in a short period of time. And I appreciate the fact that a number of you went to various websites, various television programs, various magazines to get your information. Hopefully the representative from Time Magazine will be calling me early next week so we can really make sure that those subscriptions do come starting the 17th or the week of the 17th. Now, what I want to do today is to go through until about 11:40 or 11:45 items that I believe are of interest from Chapter 2 of your hymnals, which deals with the newspaper industry. Just because I don't mention something doesn't necessarily mean it would not be canon fodder for the exam. Things that I do mention are not only of interest to me, but they might also be examination material. Some of it might be for your own benefit, and some of it might be the elusive but always exciting red herring. A friendly piece of advice. Whenever you are studying, and I've always prided myself on the fact that I always wanted to teach a course the way I was when I was a student. So what I would suggest here is that whenever you are studying, take a look at obviously the items in boldface, the items that are in italics, and also the materials, particularly at the end of the chapter, because oftentimes either true, false, or multiple choice items will come directly from that. Notes that you have taken on the videotapes, like the one last week dealing with the Little Rock newspaper war, the one that's coming up exactly 1 week from today dealing with Time Magazine and cultural issues, cultural diversity. Oftentimes those materials will come from the course outline in terms of questions. So I just really want to make sure that you understand I'm not trying to fool you. But if you don't go through the material, then you're going to be really into it deep. Let me start off here Let me start off here with material that is on pages 38 and 39. An example of a question that might be on the exam could be something along the lines of, what was the nation's first consecutively published newsletter? And in that case, it would be the Boston newsletter, which is at the bottom of page 38. I would also suggest that you have a bit of the history of newspapers in terms of an early chronology, and that is on page 39. But I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about material which is at the bottom of page 39, which is the John Peter Zenger trial. John Peter Zenger was an individual who published a newspaper in the state of New York, and he wrote in editorials and in other stories about the governor of New York, whose name was William Cosby. Here's the problem. We take for granted today the idea that the First Amendment is absolute. If I say something about you, which is an absolute fact, we take it for granted that you cannot be sued for it. The idea that truth is the best defense for libel was a concept that did not come from the British press. If you go to Great Britain today, they do not view the press in the same way that we do as the fourth estate, almost keeping politicians' feet to the fire. It's viewed more as an entertainment industry in Great Britain. Well, the idea of the free press and of the First Amendment really is an American idea. And the point that I would want you to remember behind the John Peter Zenger trial is basically that if you are sued, the truth is your absolute best defense. I was watching a documentary on television last night. We'll be talking about this later on when we get to ethics with Carol Burnett, and don't worry about writing this down. In her case, she sued the National Enquirer in the late 1970s, early 1980s, because she claimed that there were reports in there about her that were untrue. Here's your problem when you deal with broadcast or print. Something may be printed about you, something may be broadcast about you, but can you have absolute documentation that there was, quote, absolute malice in trying to go out of their way to nail you? And in Carol Burnett's case, she proved, or a jury claimed, that what she was saying was true, that these allegations that she was acting drunk in a public place were true. And her multi-million-dollar judgment against the National Enquirer eventually was sent back to, I think, about $125,000. But if you are a public figure, then basically just about anything you say can be held against you. How many of you know who Tracy Lawrence is? Former SAU student. He was a student my first semester here. Really nice kid. Still call him a kid even though he's in his 30s. He has had some problems with the tabloid media. And our students, we won't go into it, but our students asked him about that when he did one of our television shows a couple of years ago. And he said, basically, what I do is ignore the tabloids because they are business people. And my view of this is if someone does become involved in tabloid scandals, then all you have to do is just juxtapose the face of one personality one year with another personality another year, because sex, drugs, rock and roll, whatever you want to talk about, substance abuse, alcohol abuse, is basically the same. The players are the ones who are different. But the basic underpinning of what we now know as libel, again, is on pages 39 and on page 40. I don't want to belabor the point, but I just think you really need to understand that when we're talking about a free press, we have something that not many countries in the world have, at least to the same degree that we have. And if you ever go onto a British website, many of the British tabloids have what they call page 4 or page 6 girls. Does anybody know what I'm referring to when I talk about a page 4 or a page 6 girl? They are designed to boost circulation. Oftentimes they consist of scantily clad, often topless women. Now that's usually not something you're going to see in an American traditional news publication, which goes to the idea that the British press is more entertainment-oriented than the American press. Even though, of course, we do have elements of entertainment, but not to the same degree. Now, I would ask you to remember what the term partisan press means, which is on page 40. Many of the newspapers that we have today have evolved from something that was actually an arm of the Democratic or Republican Party. The Arkansas Democrat. So a number of newspapers that we have today sprang from the partisan press, which was in the late 1700s, began in the late 1700s. I would also ask you to know some of the statistics that are on 42 and 43, particularly that at the bottom as to who reads newspapers. Here we have a bit of a dichotomy because with all of you having access to websites, you can read more newspapers than you could in the past. For instance, in my case, I do not subscribe to newspapers, but I probably read about 6 a day. And just being the type of person that I am, I read them in alphabetical order according to the bookmarks on my website. Starting with the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Chicago Tribune, Washington Post, New York Times, usually about 6. And there's no reason why all of you shouldn't read every day newspapers. The Chicago Tribune is one that I particularly enjoy, as well as the Post. Next. Anyway, know some of those statistics, keeping in mind that those are probably going to be bumping upward in your demographic. Let's go on to page 45 with the alternative press. The alternative press was primarily designed so people with alternate voices, using the same form of the word twice in one sentence, pardon me for the repetition. But if you are an African American in the early part of the 19th century, chances are anything involving the suffrage movement or slavery is not going to be covered in a traditional newspaper. Many times, political movements start with some type of newspaper or some type of pamphlet or publication. And all you have to do is to rewind the clock back a few years from Ida B. Wells here on page 45 and think about what happened during the American Revolution, particularly with people like Thomas Paine with Common Sense and Benjamin Franklin. So the thing that I would ask you to really pay attention to here are some of the people who are important in the alternative press, particularly Ida B. Wells. Now, the situation in the early 19th century is quite severe. Of course, you're working without electricity. You're working in a situation where African Americans are not supposed to have any rights in the South, let alone publish a newspaper. And Ida B. Wells, who published under the pseudonym Iola, had the Memphis Free Speech and Headlines, so I would ask you to know a little about what she's done there. In fact, at the bottom of the page, she had written a story in 1892 about African American men who had been kidnapped from a Memphis jail and killed, and that was some of her most powerful writing. When we talk about dissident press, it goes beyond this to other racial and ethnic groups as well. I don't think they talk about it in here a lot, but there are also publications that discuss the idea of women's suffrage. Those of you who are historians may not necessarily realize that we have women's suffrage coming into effect, I think, in about 1920. So for the first 150 years of the United States, you had white male landowners who could vote, and after the Civil War, African American males. Okay, the penny press, which is on 46. There used to be, one of my favorite photographs used to be in one of the early editions of the text, where you see what can best be described as a waif. In one of the earliest photographs ever taken, you see some waif who looks no more than maybe 5 to 6 years old, selling the penny press on the street. And the reason they called it the penny press was because it only cost 1 penny. It was produced on very inexpensive paper, and whenever you touched the paper, the quality of the ink was so cheap that it smudged. That's how the idea of getting the ink all over you started. One advantage of the penny press in American society, now again, we're talking about the early 19th century, so we're talking about the 1800s, before the Civil War. You do not have a universal school system in the U.S. A lot of kids don't go to school. A lot of them, for lack of a better term, are being homeschooled, if that at all. So how can you foster mass readership? Primarily through the penny press. Now, the writing was more sensational. There would be more cartoons. The writing certainly would be more simplistic. The joke about USA Today when it came out in 1982 was the ink that was being used to publish the paper would not rub off on it. And media critics at the time said, the ink doesn't rub off on your fingers, and the newspaper doesn't rub off on your mind. So hopefully the quality has gotten a little better since then. We also have the idea of photojournalism, which comes not too long after the penny press. And photojournalism, as we know it in the U.S., started during the Civil War with a gentleman who's listed at the bottom of page 47, and that's Matthew Brady. Soldiers in the Civil War knew that they were going to be involved in a very serious battle if they ever saw the photographic equipment of Matthew Brady clattering up in a horse-drawn carriage. What we now know as journalism was not used in the same way 100 years ago or 150 years ago, where journalists were viewed more as nuisances. They were not viewed as professionals. They were viewed more as snoops, those who are out to not necessarily get the facts, but to sell newspapers. And of course, you can make the same analogy today to all media, especially with politicians who oftentimes do not like reporters unless they have something favorable to put out to them in the media. Now, beyond this, we have on 48 and 49, and I'm giving you the Cliff's Notes version here because you can take care of all the other minutiae yourself. So I'm giving you the quick version, but let's hopscotch ahead to the end of the century. Newspaper competition, as we know it in large markets, probably to the best be quantified with the newspaper war between William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, and their war starts on page 48. I would ask you to remember the term yellow journalism. Yellow journalism being a precursor to now what we know as tabloid journalism. Later on in this chapter, they talk about something called jazz journalism, which is an offshoot of tabloid, primarily dealing with the jazz era in the 1920s. The reason that this particular war is important, and the reason that it is ironic, is that here you have Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, for lack of a better term, not necessarily making up stories, but a lot of these stories are at best stretching the truth. Oftentimes I have asked people on an exam, why is it ironic that the most prestigious award in print journalism, and I think they have to broadcast awards too, but why is one of the most prestigious awards in print journalism ironic? Because it's named after Joseph Pulitzer, who was one of the kings of journalism. So someone who is, during his time, not necessarily known for fairness and accuracy, those awards are in his name. It's like the Nobel Peace Prize. What did Alfred Nobel do? He invented dynamite, the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, if I had to stick a dynamite in my end, I suppose I could be somewhat peaceful myself. Anyway, whenever you're looking at the material between Pulitzer and Hearst, particularly look at the Spanish-American War, I feel like, and it's not something I can always convey to people, but I feel like if you know some of the history or some of the chronology particularly, because I always like chronology because one thing begets another, or begets another, it gives you a better perspective on how things are today. Have things changed all that much? To a certain degree, yes. To a certain degree, no. When we take a look at tabloid journalism today, it might not necessarily be that what you see other than the Inquirer or the Star, but television programs in the early to mid-1990s, like A Current Affair, like Inside Edition, might deal more with the sensational than with things that you need to know. Somebody in here asked me the other day the difference between hard news and feature news for the first term paper. If you take a look at some of the magazine shows on television, like Inside Edition, like Access Knowledge, like Extra, even to a certain degree like Entertainment Tonight, those would be feature-based stories. Something that you don't necessarily need to know about, but sometimes it's salacious, sometimes it's interesting. For instance, as I was getting ready to come in this morning, I was watching Regis, and they showed a videotape clip of Britney Spears undressing at last night's MTV Awards. So that certainly would be a feature-based story. Now, next we go beyond yellow journalism. And by the way, let me explain why the term yellow journalism has the name. Pulitzer or Hearst, I can't remember which, basically took a comic strip away from the other newspaper, and this was a very popular comic strip during the 20th century called The Yellow Kid. And that's how the term yellow journalism got its name. Yellow basically meaning, as we know it today, stretching the boundaries of truth. Whenever I ask you to write a term paper, for instance, that would not be a tabloid term paper. Ideally, it would be something that is hard or a feature of nature, where you're just not making it up from whole cloth. Well, I went to the movies the other night. This is basically coming right out of your brain. So, anyway, whenever we're talking about jazz journalism, which is basically the same thing, I think about the photograph which is on page 50. And if you look at that photograph, you think, at what angle was that particular photograph shot? Well, of course, what happened in this case was the person who took the photograph did it surreptitiously. I believe, and I have to go back and read it, but the reporter was either wearing a dress or big slacks, and she lifted up either part of her dress or her pants leg, and had a camera with a very slow exposure on it. Because when someone is executed like that, you almost never see the photographs. You can imagine how many copies that sold. And then, of course, next to it, you have the 1990s version, the National Enquirer in its own understated fashion, with these headlines: Stars and AIDS, Who's Got It, Courage, Heartbreak, and Tears. Yeah, and they believe in that courage and heartbreak so much they put it in bold face on the cover of the paper. George Michael's Secret Life: How AIDS Tragedy Led to Arrest in Men's Room. Now, there's a lot we could say there, but we're just going to let that go. I mean, you probably remember the stories about George and him being caught exploring the wonders of his own body in the public restroom. And then you have here at the top anorexia horror for Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Tammy Wynette, her loving husband, opens his heart to Enquirer readers. Roma Downey hires armed guards. So, as you can see, they're basically trying to cover 7 or 8 different individuals with stories, and if you take a look at the Enquirer or the Star, or my personal favorite, the Weekly World News. What I like about the Weekly World News, it makes no allusions to what it's all about. In 1992 or 1996, there was a picture of Bill Clinton either shaking hands with or being next to an alien on the cover of Weekly World News, and the cover story indicated that space aliens have endorsed Bill Clinton for president. And the people in the Clinton campaign thought that was a hoot, and they were making fun of it. So even these folks want to continue building that bridge to the 21st century. Even space aliens want to do that, and they have no vested interest in our ineligible vote. Next, here's where you run into some real financial problems, and it's directly underneath the headlines from the 1920s newspaper and the National Enquirer, and it's the element of unionization. Unionization, encouraging professionalism, is absolutely true. But if you are in a large market, if you are starting up a newspaper, or you are taking over a newspaper, is it necessarily, as a businessman or businesswoman, in your best interest to have a union? Think about it from a perspective. There's a reason why people are so because he didn't have to worry about union restrictions. If you are in a union, there are certain guidelines that we're going to have to adhere to, including salary, including benefits. Whereas if you're non-union, that's not necessarily something you have to adhere to. Keep in mind, you'll notice now on page 51, they have folks who are on strike. This is something that happens a few times a year in large urban markets. When you become a member of the union, you do not want to break the union, because if you do, what do you become? Yeah, they call you a scab. In other words, if you are a member of a union and you adhere to all the restrictions, you pay the dues, and you're willing to take the benefits, if you jump the picket line, then basically you are, according to them, being a hypocrite. In this part of the country, you will not find many newspapers, if any, that are union-based. And it doesn't necessarily mean that unions are bad, but if you are a business person and you have the option to either be union or to be non-union, put yourself in that position. Are you going to be union or non-union? Probably go non-union because the costs for publication are going to be less. Nothing against being in a union, but that's just something that you always have to consider from a financial standpoint. Now, let me talk about declining readership at the bottom of page 51. I would argue that, again, this text came out before the fall of '97, and the new one will begin next year, even though it's out on the market now. Declining readership probably has plateaued and may be back on the rise, but primarily because of online publication. So I would take some of that with a grain of salt. Now, you folks are going to be the exceptions to the rule because by nature you are going to be more inquisitive and read more. And in terms of reading more, if you would like to read someone who really knew how to write well, and in such a way where you could actually visualize what he was saying, which is one of the most difficult types of writing there is, I would encourage you to read pages 52 and 53 about Ernie Kyle, who died at a very young age, right at the end of World War II. And I suppose to capsulize the material about Ernie Kyle, you could best claim that he is the individual who humanized World War II. Now, when World War II was going on, if you wrote a letter, as my father did to my mother, even though they were reporting at the time, these letters were heavily censored. Anything that you read at the time was heavily censored. Through these particular columns that Ernie Kyle wrote, that was one way that the American public could really know what was going on in the field. Movies, newspapers, letters being censored. You can find out in his particular case, in his last newspaper article that was taken off of his body after he had been killed in one of the final battles of the war. I think he stood up and he was shot by a sniper. If you read near the end of this piece, you'll say the thing that he remembers from World War II, or will remember, was dead bodies. Cold, dead bodies anywhere you look. And it humanized the war in a way that those folks who were reading censored material at home never got to see. For instance, no one who was involved in the war ever got to see dead bodies on film until the war was almost over. Now, you contrast that with Vietnam, it's a totally different situation. So press censorship can certainly take place in wartime. Now, also at the bottom of that page, it talks about what it's like to work for a newspaper. All I would say is know what some of the responsibilities are. I think that's very important. I'll probably toss in a couple of those on the exam. And I also, in my notes on page 54, wrote down editor and publisher. And the only reason I would ask you to remember editor and publisher is primarily because when you go to the Interactive Syllabus website, one of the links is to editor and publisher fleshes. It gives you an opportunity to read literally any newspaper in the world that is online. One of the first days of class, I talked about the Nevada County Picayune, and someone in here indicated they were from Prescott or from that area. You could literally read anything from this area or something around the world. Those of you who would like to brush up on your foreign language skills, because the MCOM majors need 2 years of a foreign language, can go to a French language newspaper or a Spanish language newspaper and pick up some lingo that way. When we're talking about business, which is in page 54, at the bottom of the page, along with online newspapers, I would ask you to remember, and it's not in your book, but most of the online newspapers that you can get from editor and publisher that I mentioned a moment ago, most of those publications are available to you free. Very few of them do you actually have to pay a subscription fee. Now, whenever my computer has gone down or there's been a problem with my computer and I have to reboot, the only newspaper that I have to actually log into, even though it's free, is the New York Times on the web. There's one newspaper that I'm aware of, and there are probably more, but there is at least one major newspaper at this time that you just cannot go to without paying a subscription fee. And I would ask you to remember that because it is one of the few online publications that does this, and it is the Wall Street Journal. One of the most widely read publications not only in the world, or not only in the United States, but throughout the world. Financial information, where everything else is pretty much provided to you free. So that's why if you have access to a networked computer, especially one at home, where you don't have to worry about resetting the bookmarks every time, I would at least have editor and publisher bookmarked and then your favorite newspapers, because you can go to them at any time. That includes many television stations, because now you can see little video clips on the web or listen to them. So there's no reason to not be informed, as I say for the 9th time today. Next, on 55, I want to talk about USA Today. USA Today, when it came out in 1982, and I remember this very well, was heavily lampooned. Who would want to read a national newspaper? Who would want to read a newspaper that is written in such a way, almost like television news? Who would want to read a newspaper that has colored pictures in it? Who would want to read a newspaper that has multicolored graphs? Who would want to read a newspaper that has that terrible term, factoid? That is Factoid. Sounds like you ate too fast, and now you have factoid. 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 Now, if you want to make the television analogy, a factoid in USA Today would be analogous, aka similar, to something that you will see before a commercial on headline news, which in Magnolia is Channel 99. And it'll say something along the lines of $385 billion in student loans were distributed in 1999-2000. It's a fact that there is no beyond substance, there is no meaning behind that message. It's just thrown out there. When USA Today first came out, as I mentioned, a lot of people did not like it because it was something totally different. In fact, if you look at a USA Today news rack, it is intentionally shaped like a television set. And the reason it's shaped like a television set is because there is a color picture always above the fold and at least one large newspaper headline. Now, I want you to think about this. If you go back and look at newspapers from the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, if you look at an old newspaper, just like back on page 50 with the Daily News, instead of just having one word, dead, there would usually be something all the way across. For instance, it might say something like, Gore attacks Bush. But there was always something all the way to the top of the newspaper, and that really ended in the 1980s. And you can give USA Today credit for that, because they usually feature 2 or 3 or 4 different items, again, above the fold. So if you're looking at it in a newspaper rack, you can find items that may be of interest to you. And USA Today did something else, and I definitely want you to remember this. In the past, when you wrote for a newspaper, of course, you always use that inverted pyramid style. The most important facts came at the beginning and then they funneled down. So if there were 1 or 2 paragraphs at the end of the story that could be usable, but because of space constraints, you had to cut them off, it didn't affect the rest of the story. USA Today changed that because USA Today had a format. And no matter what, the format had to be filled by the story. So if you have 3 or 4 column inches, the story's going to go there no matter what. It's not necessarily going to be pushed to another page of the paper unless that's part of its overall goal. And USA Today is broken down into specific color-coded sections. The front section is news, 1 section is business, 1 section is sports, and 1 section is, for lack of a better term, lifestyle. And I know that's not what it is. And they are color-coded, in case you can't read, apparently. Now, also know that USA Today was called at the beginning the paper. Because Many people felt it was using the McDonald's fast food format in newspaper preparation, but I'll tell you how dumb they were. They were, quote, so dumb that they used computers and satellite transmission to take that information from a newspaper and send it out to a number of regional plants. That's how dumb they were. The only newspapers who were doing that at the time were the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. That's how you could get mass readership. They were also so dumb, quote, that they decided to have an attribution policy. Now you might say, okay, what's an attribution policy? It means that if I'm a reporter for USA Today and I'm reporting on a story and I need to quote somebody, I always quote the source. You read USA Today carefully, you will never find an unattributed source. They are always quoted. Now that does hinder investigative journalism because if you're an investigative journalist, chances are you're going to have to go on deep background or you're going to use unattributed sources because people don't want to get in trouble. The whistleblower syndrome. I would also ask you to remember the name of one person whom I don't believe is mentioned in here, whose idea it was in 1980 to come up with the idea of USA Today. And his name is Allen, A-L-L-E-N, Newhart, N-E-U-H-A-R-T-H. That's Allen with an E, N-E-U-H-A-R-T-H. He was the head of Gannett at the time, and you don't have to remember this part of it, but he had been editor of a newspaper called Florida Today, which was, again, unique in the way it was phrased, Florida Today, starting with the idea of making stories different. And Gannett did have some bumps along the way, the Arkansas Gazette being one of them, as you know from the videotape last week, but there have been more successes than failures. So definitely know about USA Today. And if you feel like before the exam you need to know more about it, there are a number of places in Magnolia where you can pick up a USA Today. In front of post office, in front of at least, I don't know if it's King's Inn or what's the other one? Right across the street. Coachman's Inn. There are 7 or 8 USA Today places in town where you can go pick up one from a rack. I know there is one at the Easy Mart, which is right across the street from Burger King, right next to Western Sizzling. So, yeah, there's a number of them. There's a number of them you can go to look at paper. But the fact that they have categorized different sections, and that whatever you write has to be written in a particular style and has to fit the space. Those are 2 big changes from a traditional newspaper. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I subscribed to USA Today for a couple of years. Came to Magnolia, wanted to continue my subscription. I called the 800 number, and this is what they said back in like August of '87. Mr. Reppert, which is what they said, Mr. Reppert, we cannot continue your same-day subscription in Magnolia because USA Today does not get to Magnolia until the next day. Okay, you can't get a newspaper here the same day? No, and to me, day old news didn't mean anything, so I stopped my subscription, but I still pick it up too. I think it's a pretty good read. One of the places that USA Today is quite popular is a place where you can pick it up anywhere. Airports are very popular, especially the big 3, USA Today, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal. But you have to be careful when you look at USA Today. They used to try to pull a fast one and say, read by 5.3 million readers a day, or some number to that effect. A paper can be read. All of you could read this book. That doesn't mean that you all purchase it. So you always have to look at subscription numbers, or how many people buy the paper each day, not by how many readers. So that's deceptive math. A good try, but deceptive nonetheless. Next, how is technology, on page 56, how is technology going to change newspapers as we know them? It's probably going to be somewhat different than the way we see them today. The wireless internet is on the way, or might already be here. The day is probably not that far away where you can take something which is similar to a laptop and literally dial in the newspaper of your choice. That day's probably not too far away. If you feel comfortable reading off of a computer screen, and not a lot of people do, but that doesn't bother me at all. But there's only, like you'll see on the Magnolia Banner News website, there is only so much information if you go to the Banner News website that you can get from actually reading the internet version. If you want more information, as it clearly says on the website, buy the Banner News. Because if you put everything out there, if I have a network computer, why do I need to buy the paper? So, at this point, I believe the penetration of computers into the home is roughly about 50%, maybe a little more. And you cannot assume that people are always going to read newspapers, just like in the early days of VCR. You couldn't assume that people were going to be able to program them, because if you go to a friend's house, how many times will you see the VCR flashing 12 o'clock? So, you can't assume everyone's going to be a technophile. Okay, next. Let's go to the end of the chapter, which is on page 61. There is something that I declined to mention, and this is something that I would ask you to write down. I will give you the spelling of it twice. And this is one of those occasions where I do not use an instructor's manual. Well, this one says instructor's edition, but I usually don't, because I don't pay attention to what the instructor's edition says. I always write down my name. There are certain things in the text, as I have mentioned to you, that will not be addressed necessarily by me in some things will. Here's one that is not in the book. I'd ask you to spell this out. I'll give it to you twice. D-A-G-U-P-R-R-E-O-T-Y-P-E. I will repeat like the National Spelling Competition. D-A-G-U-E-R-R-E-O-T-Y-P-E. Anybody get it one more time? Okay. This is a daguerreotype. A daguerreotype goes back to the early days of photojournalism. Before we had photographs as we now know them today, or even the days of Matthew Brady, we go one step behind to the late 1830s or early 1840s. All right, I know you can't see this, you can't laugh too loudly, but that is my, with a smirk on my face, aka George W. apparently, but that's my driver's license picture. Okay? That is an actual representation of me, God help the photographer. A daguerreotype was not a true representation of your face. A daguerreotype looked like a photograph, but it was a mirror image. So if you could look in the mirror and think of that as an old black and white photograph, that's what a daguerreotype was. So early photojournalism used that technique. If you could imagine sitting in place for 20 minutes at a time, you wonder why so many of the folks in those old daguerreotypes and photographs look like they're irritated beyond belief. They couldn't move. If you look at an old daguerreotype, which I'm sure all of you will when you go out and go home today, of John Quincy Adams. Did anybody see the movie Amistad? Okay, Michael Green, one of my students who graduated in 1990, got his master's degree, but he's in that movie. Shameless plug, but that's not the point. John Quincy Adams, at the end of his life, had a daguerreotype taken of him, and he looks very stern. But even in that old daguerreotype, the picture is blurry. And the reason the picture is blurry is because you try holding that pose for 20 minutes. It just can't be done. So the daguerreotype was one of the first methods by which photographs could be taken, but very, 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 very bad in terms of just having to wait. I wanted to mention here before we wrap it up here today the in focus materials on 61 and 62. They reinforce items that I had addressed here involving John Peter Zenger, the Penny Press. I also have one circled at the bottom of the page, involving cooperative news gathering. I did not mention during class today the Associated Press or United Press International. Suffice it to say, if you go to the New York Times website or the Las Vegas Sun, which I have a vested interest in since I went to graduate school in Las Vegas, if you go to a website that has national news or international news, those stories or those recaps are not printed by the papers. Those are cooperative news gathering efforts, usually put on the wire by the Associated Press. And the reason the Associated Press is important is because if you ever want to talk about who has power in the media, you could make an argument that people who write for the Associated Press have power because every news organization in America, whether it be newspaper or television or new media, has access to the AP wire. And to work for the AP, you have to be a good writer, and you have to write in a non-biased, non-gender fashion. It is extremely difficult. If you've ever seen the AP writer's test, it is not easy. You have to really be a quality writer. And Lord knows you'll have an opportunity in here to write your heart out. Now this weekend, if you haven't done so already, let me implore you once again to start videotaping newscasts. If you haven't done so, do it now. Go to the website and check the requirements because these are national, not local. They are national. So videotape your brains out this weekend, and then that will give you a benchmark by which to put your paper together. And again, after the paper, you have one page which is a reference page. You don't have to follow APA or MLA style. You can use RES style, which is the reference educational style. As long as there is some type of consistency with your format, what you watched and when, that lends credibility to you. So whenever I look at your paper, I know what you watched, I know when you watched it, and I watch all these programs too, and I have a pretty good idea of the way in which these programs are structured, formatted, and written. If you have any questions about that between now and Wednesday, please let me know. So that is the E your P's approach to Chapter 2. On Chapter 3, we will be discussing that on Monday. So we'll see you then. Bobby Knight somewhere in Canada getting manager.
I think he's in there fire. He's a man.
Anyway, here's my guess. He'll probably wind up this year, if somebody doesn't hire him before the beginning of the basketball season, he'll still be around probably as a television commentator. Now, all right, I'll let that one pass. That's one piece of speculation that I hadn't heard. But okay. Anyway, for those of you who didn't get an opportunity the other day to pick up your books for the extra credit, remember they're across the way now. Whenever you go to the website and your extra credit may not necessarily be noted on there, let me know. I try to be diligent in getting everyone with extra credit points on there. I want to talk about that just for a second. Now remember, one of the few areas in which I will exercise my friendly dictatorial-like powers, the only voice I want to hear in here is my own. Whenever we're talking about those term papers, on Wednesday, I want all of you to bring them to class. That way we can go around the horn and very briefly, in a minute or two, talk about some of the findings that you found in them. Now remember, and I was as guilty of this as anyone else. I used to write 15 to 20 page term papers literally the night before they were due. So I don't care when you get them done, but whenever you complete them, make sure that they are done with proper grammar, with proper capitalization, all of that before class, and that way I can take them with me and grade them over the weekend and get them back to you on Monday. But I want you to go back to the projects area of the interactive syllabus and look exactly at those instructions that I give you. You don't necessarily have to follow them to a T. I tried to give you more than enough information to fill 4 to 5 pages. That should not be a problem at all. I think the problem that some of you may have is that if you wait until the last minute, you will not have 3 different newscasts to analyze. So make sure that you pay close attention to those instructions. In terms of comparison, contrast, or evaluation, I'm looking for 3. That way you really get a good barometer of what a network might do as opposed to what a cable network might do. The cable networks have the luxury of going literally 24 hours, even though a lot of that time isn't technically news. If you pay close attention to CNN or MSNBC, a lot of the time during those, quote, 24-hour, 7-day-a-week news blocks is set up for programs which are technically newsy nature, but it's not like they're updating the top stories every 15 minutes. We live in a large radio market like Dallas, St. Louis, or Chicago, where you have news radio stations. And my definition of news radio growing up was the top story being updated every 15 to 20 minutes. And whenever the skip wave comes up at night, which means to pick up certain AM radio stations in as many as 38 states, I like to listen to some of the news radio stations out of Dallas or WBBM, which I listened to in high school out of Chicago. All of those are news radio stations. That technically fits the news definition more than maybe what you might find on television. But if you're watching CNN, for instance, you'll have more opportunities to try to figure out within your own particular schedule how many stories are being played in a particular hour. And it may not necessarily be a, quote, traditional newscast like you would see with Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw. So a lot of it depends upon the time of day. Now, I can tell you, and people often ask me, well, what do you like to watch? Well, I can tell you this is why we have 3 televisions and 2 VCRs, because it's very difficult for Mrs. Reppert to put up with me because I'm a channel surfing maniac. I have very little patience. So one of the programs that I do watch every night, and usually if I am working late, I'll watch the midnight repeat because I don't get to bed until early in the morning, is the midnight repeat on CNBC, which is Channel 25 in Magnolia, and that's the news with Brian Williams, and that's Channel 25. So literally any time of day you can watch television news, including if you just have basic cable, you can pick up Channel 99, which is headline news. And their headline news block usually goes from the top or the bottom of the hour to about 7 or 8 minutes uninterrupted before they take a commercial break. So even if you still need the videotape material, there is no reason for you not to be able to. So make sure that you have all that done. What? Headline news is 24 hours a day. That is a national, and it's put together by CNN, which is Ted Turner's baby. It is every half hour, 24 hours a day, it is a different national newscast. It's like a headline service.
So it's up to like 7 minutes of an hour.
If headline news was included as part of my analysis, all I would need is one broadcast. They break it down very simply. They have a block of news, then they'll have a commercial, they'll have a second block of news, then they will go to business news, then they'll take a break and they'll do headline sports, then they'll come back with a minute's worth of entertainment news, and my guess is they're very programmatic, almost like USA Today in terms of newspaper structure. They'll probably have for their entertainment news today how many television programs won Emmy Awards last night. That's what they usually have for their entertainment news. And then after their entertainment news, they usually take a break and they'll come back and have some type of a soft or feature story. Something that you don't necessarily need to know, but it's kind of nice to know. There's a story about Dolly the sheep or something overseas where she's celebrating her 3rd birthday or something after being cloned. That's something that you can always use as a standby. The network news is always on at 5:30 each night, and make sure that you understand the background of the assignment. We're talking about network-based news, not local news. That's set aside for the term paper that is due the day after the presidential election, where half of it deals with campaign advertisements and half of it deals with local or regional news coverage. To me, this is a good assignment for you if you've never done anything like this before, because it forces you to watch television news in a way you probably never thought of before. For instance, and I don't want to get on a long dissertation about this, NBC with Tom Brokaw has been #1 in the ratings for a few years now. He took over from ABC with Peter Jennings. Despite the fact there are more news opportunities for you to watch during the day on television, there has been a great deal of criticism among those in the media, particularly media critics, that the NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw on occasion is too soft, where they deal with more people features, because theoretically people can go to their computer and watch or listen or read news, or they can get it literally anytime during the day. That's been one of the major complaints against NBC. Whether or not the network newscasts in their current formats will continue into the next century, and by the way, we're not in the 21st century yet. Bill Clinton hasn't built that bridge to the 21st century. There was no year zero. So we're still technically in the last year of the 20th century. But whether or not newscasts as we know them will endure remains to be seen. My guess is by the time you folks get to be my age in your early 40s, there will be some melding of computers and television, and it will have taken place many years previous to that. And high-definition television, which I've been talking about since the first semester I taught this class, which is fall of '88, is finally coming to fruition, where you can get those small, flat panel TV screens that are really not much thicker than my watch because they use the same type of technology, the LCD, the liquid crystal display. Anyway, if you have any questions about those later on, feel free to let me know, but please make sure that when you see those deadlines, and I'm pretty good about this, I think I'm very fair when it comes to grading. One thing I don't like to do is back and fill. Backing and filling meaning that the dog ate your homework, or your computer crashed, or you're waiting for new parts to come in from overseas or whatever. Just get your stuff done, get it to me on time, and we'll never have a problem. And as you saw the media quizzes, some of you would give me more information, some would give me less. I think for the term papers, you probably want to err on the side of giving me a little bit more analysis rather than less. That way, if you have any flaws in your reasoning, it gives me a greater benchmark by which to give you a fair grade. Also, when you go to the website, you'll notice that that editor and publisher link not only lets you go to newspapers and magazines, but it also lets you go to television stations and television networks. So if you are maybe 3.5 pages and you're not sure how to address the rest of it, you can always go to a network or to an affiliate which has network scripts on them, and you can take a look at the way in which a network news script is written, just in case you need to put a little extra information in there. Now, today I want to talk about magazines, and like I said, Wednesdays are the term paper, and Fridays we have the videotape dealing with Time Magazine and cultural diversity in media. There will be a question on the first exam coming up in 9 days about that. How I will address it, I'm not certain. I will phrase it by saying this. If you go back and read excerpts of Time Magazine from 1936, when Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals in the Olympics, you would probably guess that an African American did not write the story about Jesse Owens because very much featured in the story was his, quote, dusky complexion and kinked hair. Now, to most of us, that would come across as being blatantly racist in 2000 rhetoric. Well, who was writing Time Magazine in 1936? White males. One of the white males, and one of the things you'll notice in this particular videotape is that even women had a problem in the 1960s. You could go to an Ivy League school and still not be a reporter for Time Magazine. You were a researcher. So you will find a number of prominent African American and female writers and editorialists for Time Magazine who talk about not only the change in the way that magazine was written, but the way in which stories have changed in their tenor just because of the individuals who are writing them, the backgrounds that people have. Anyway, that will come up on Friday. There certainly will be either a short answer or essay question on Exam 1 dealing with that. I just think it's important for you to realize that Because something is written in 1936 doesn't necessarily mean that it is inferior. It's just that you would do substantial rewriting to it. Now, as far as magazines, and I want to go through the room on this, I'll start with the young lady here in front who I'm pointing to. Hello, good morning, and then we'll just move all the way across. What I want to do is, before we get into a diatribe on magazines, what magazines do you either read or what magazines do you subscribe to? And I would ask each of you to give me one or two. Go.
Anything.
Home decorating and
Is Home Decorating a magazine?
yeah.
Okay. By the way, how much does it cost for a Sports Illustrated subscription nowadays? Oh, okay. No, that's fine. Go ahead. Yeah. Vibe? Okay. Didn't there used to be a Vibe TV show? Yeah. And all of a sudden it went off the air. Okay. All the way in the back. Okay. Eric? Probably the photography. Okay.
People and content.
How much does it cost to buy? Do you have people on subscription? How much does people cost on subscription basis? That's not too bad. Go ahead. Does anybody get Ms. Magazine? The reason I ask is because, does anybody know who started Ms. Magazine? MS, Ms. No. No. No, she would probably be in a media quiz this week. Gloria Steinem, who is now 66, came up with the idea for Ms. Magazine in 1970 because she felt for a number of women around the time of the Equal Rights Amendment, or Equal Rights for Women, she felt that she was in her 30s, early 40s. She didn't want to be called Miss, and obviously she didn't want to be called Mr., so she came up with the idea of Ms. in Ms. Magazine. So here she is, at the age of 66, getting married over the weekend for the first time. And I believe her new husband is 61. Okay, directly behind Sam, what do you watch? Or what do you read? Okay. See, I was a charter subscriber to ESPN, the magazine, and one thing that really bothered me was not the format, but the early editions of the magazine. Are they still produced every other week, like Rolling Stone, once a fortnight, or are they every week?
Like I get it every 2 weeks.
Every 2 weeks? There were a lot of copy editing problems in some of the early magazines where words would trail off and nothing was there. Occasionally, like if you watch the billboard announcements on Channel 13, I noticed this over the weekend. I don't know who Emily Pittman is, but she celebrated her 18th birthday over the weekend. Is that? I'm looking at this graphic. We'll tell her happy birthday. And tell her I spelled it correctly. But you see this graphic, and it says she's 18 and legal, which is what it said. Happy 18th birthday, without a Y. Now, how stupid do you have to be to realize that the graphic is messed up? And that's what bothers me about ESPN, the magazine, even though I'm sure they got rid of that by now. And they're still trying to get subscribers. It's relatively inexpensive, like $26 for a subscription or something free. It's not too bad. Monica, what do you read? What was the last magazine you read? Nothing at all? Okay, behind. Go ahead.
Trucking, Guitar Man.
Trucking?
Yeah.
We'll talk about audience segmentation in a minute because these are very important things. Okay, go ahead. Okay.
Southern Living, 17
Southern Living a couple of years ago featured, what's his name? I can't remember. Mr. Sullivan, the bed and breakfast here in Magnolia. They had a big story on it. And what I didn't realize is that Southern Living will not only segment its audience, but it will segment certain editions, where something you might get in Arkansas will be totally different than what you find elsewhere. Go ahead. Okay. Just bringing the class to a dead halt. Well, why do you read Ducks Unlimited? Well, there's nothing wrong with ducks. It's better than egrets.
That's the only thing I'm...
It's all right. Better than egrets Unlimited. And what? Spin? Okay. We're gonna talk about that in a couple of minutes. The not the knockoff spin, but something like it, which is gear. I'm gonna talk about that. Go. What'd you say the first one was?
That's the cleaner version. Oh, yeah.
Is Maximus something that is geared towards?
It's the male cosmo.
It's the male cosmo. All right. I hope she has her tape recorder on over there.
That's what we been talking about.
Because I'll hold that against you for random. All right. Here's my point. It is very easy to tell the demographic group that a particular magazine is appealing to, whether it's anything from Maximum, Ducks Unlimited, to ESPN, or Cosmo. It's very easy to tell the demographic they're trying to reach by taking a look at the advertisements in the publication. The first magazine I ever subscribed to was Sports Illustrated, and most of the advertisements in there were catered to young or a male audience in their 20s or 30s. That's why in many of these magazines I've joked about the inserts that have the god-awful scent in them. Well, they're trying to cater to people who like white diamonds or whatever publication they can. Okay, let me go to page 67. For those of you who have your text, you can follow along here. If we talk about a demographic group, and let me give you three different examples, and these don't necessarily mean they'll be on the exam, but I think he was talking about Maxima, which I've never heard of. But
Sure, Mr. Reppert.
no, I haven't. I've led a very sheltered life. Anyway, one magazine that got a lot of publicity in the past year was something called Gear, G-E-A-R, and it is trying to appeal to young males. Bless you. Now, how many people in here know what I'm talking about when I say Gear magazine? All right. Can anyone tell me who has been on the cover of Gear magazine in the last year? Was she?
Oh, I don't know.
That soccer player, Brandy Chastain, was she on it?
I don't know if she was. The person that I do recall is the actress who plays Sabrina the Teenage Witch.
She was on Maximum.
Thought she did
she's
see
on
Maximum.
Okay, well, let me change that.
See, you have.
No. Occasionally, I will make a mistake intentionally to try to trip you up. No, but the reason that she got a lot of publicity, the magazine got a lot of publicity, was because she was quote dressed provocatively for the cover and talked about the intimate details of her personal life in it. So if you're talking about these types of magazines, they are catering to young males. Now, if you take a look at something that would also be catered to young males, like, for instance, the WWF magazine, that is a blatant advertisement for that particular wrestling promotion. The other one that I had mentioned previously, and I'd ask you to write this one down, is called Talk, T-A-L-K. Now, this had a huge rollout. I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but it bears repeating because this type of magazine, which was sponsored in part by Rupert Murdoch's organization, who, according to the author of the text, is one of the moguls of the media, had a multi-million-dollar rollout. I think what I want you to remember most of all from this is that starting a new magazine is an extremely expensive undertaking. You have to have really deep pockets to do so. And I would like to give you one example of someone who did have really deep pockets, who, until her death a couple of years ago, had really changed the landscape of magazines that were catered to professional women who were in their 50s, 60s. And I would ask you to remember this. The lady who passed away a few years ago, her first name is Frances, F-R-A-N-C-E-S. And her last name is Lear, L-E-A-R. This is not in your book. Frances Lear was a divorcee. Her ex-husband was the gentleman who developed television programs in the 1970s. These included All in the Family, The Jeffersons, Maude. A lot of those sitcoms recorded on videotape that you'll now see on either TV Land or Nick at Night. They got divorced. Mrs. Lear, Frances Lear, got a settlement in the tens of millions of dollars. Now remember, if you are a television producer and you hit it big, that's like a cash register. Anytime that program is shown around the world, you get a cut of the action. You may not necessarily get it if you're a star, but if you're a producer and you own it, then anywhere in the world that program runs, you get a piece of the action. So Frances Lear got half of what her husband had produced. And Mr. Lear had left his wife for a younger woman.
What?
Mr. Lear had left his wife for a younger woman.
Okay.
So what did Mrs. Lear do? She decided to start a magazine that catered to professional women in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. And this magazine, and she was trying to think of a name, and someone said, why don't you just use your own name? That way you can, whenever they hear the term Lear's magazine, they'll immediately think of professional women who are slightly older, and that's what she did. The title of the magazine, and I don't know if it's still published today, but the title of the magazine was Lear's, L-E-A-R-S. Now, there are two reasons for my mentioning this. First of which is professional women at this point did not necessarily have something catered to them that were older than 40. Maybe you could say Mirabella would be something that was catered to younger professional women. But in the case of Lear's magazine, it really did fill a demographic niche. And that's why the text calls it audience segmentation. I call it demographics. My point is, look at any magazine on a news rack, and you can pretty much figure out the audience it's being catered to and what type of a publication it is. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. There are a couple of items in the green box at the top of page 67. There are two dates. You don't necessarily need to know the dates, but I would ask you to remember the individual involved, and they come up later in the chapter. Time magazine, which hopefully will be getting coming 17th of this month, was developed by a man whose name was Henry Luce. Now, the name is not necessarily as important as what he did. Unfortunately, sometimes on exams, people will ask you who a certain person was or what year something came out. The chronology is not necessarily as important as what the person did. If you take a look, and a couple of people in here said that they read People magazine. Some people might read Time magazine. The Time Life empire, as we know it today, sprang from that magazine that Henry Luce put together. Now, if he could come back in the year 2000 and look at his publication, he might say, what have they done to my baby? Because his magazine in format would probably be similar to U.S. News and World Report today. Time magazine has a very daunting task. It fights against Newsweek and other publications. So instead of always dealing with hard news, it will deal with soft or feature stories. That's why if you see someone on Time magazine who is more pop culture than traditional hard news, one of the reasons is people recognize that individual on the cover when they're in an airport or when they're in a newsstand. They might be more inclined to buy it. If you have a subscription, it doesn't necessarily matter. And by the way, the large majority of revenue for magazines will come from subscriptions. I was going to bring one of those magazine blow-in cards today, one of the 8 that falls out of every TV guide that we get. But I'll bring one of those to class on Wednesday. Now, the reason I mentioned Time magazine in the green box is because directly above it in 1945, you have a gentleman whose name is John Johnson. A student came into this class in 1991. Why I remember this, I don't know. I don't get out much, I guess. But he came into class and he brought a Life magazine, which I don't believe is printed anymore. A Life magazine, which was a photojournalistic feature, which was very popular until television and movies hit the scene, particularly television. He brought in a Life magazine from like 1959. And what struck me about this publication, which ostensibly is a national publication. Now, of course, he was wanting to show me something else, but that's not what I paid attention to. 1959, when I was 1 year old, I'm looking at this publication, and there is not a black face in it. There is not a Latino face in it. There is hardly a woman's face in it, other than the stereotype of the woman standing in front of the sink or standing there, wife mopping the floor with some type of wax concoction. So if you are an African American, or if you are a Latino, or if you are a woman in the late 1950s, what kinds of publications are you going to look at? Well, John Johnson, and this is why 1945 is crucial, not necessarily the date, but what he did. If you look at Ebony magazine from the 40s and 50s, even into the 60s, the style of Ebony magazine is very close to Life magazine, even down to the way the graphics are put together. There was not a publication that African Americans could read. We'll talk about this later on when we get to the movie chapter in the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, where there were stereotypes of African Americans in early days of the 1900s, but there were no realistic depictions in the same way with magazines. So when you look at Ebony magazine or Jet magazine or even Vibe magazine, as the young lady mentioned back, you are really talking about something that began with John Johnson more than 50 years ago. And as I recall, either he or someone in his family also owns a piece of BET, Black Entertainment Television. Now, let's move on. Go to page 69. And I'm going to take it for granted that you'll read stuff on women's issues and social crusades because it will all be cannon fodder for the exam. When we're talking about political commentary, the same thing applies. If you look at the top of page 69, you'll see a publication called The Crisis. Directly underneath, you'll see a recent edition. The Crisis is a publication of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And the individual responsible for putting the Crisis together in the early 1900s was a man named W.E.B. Du Bois, the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard. That is not in your text. It's in the text. He has three first names. His name is actually William Edward Burkhart Du Bois. But it's W.E.B. Those are his initials. That's what he went by. W.E.B. Du Bois. It's in the middle of page 69. He was the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard. But here's his problem. Du Bois gets his doctorate, and he thinks that is going to be the way for him to teach literally at any university in the country. That's not the case. He had done some studying, and you'd have to write this down. He had done some studying in Germany, some postgraduate work, and indicated that he had a measure of freedom in Europe that he never had in the United States because he was treated like anyone else. I suppose the epiphany for him would be analogous to Malcolm X after he went on his trip to Mecca in 1964 or 65, where Malcolm X had always assumed before he went on his trip to Mecca that people around the world were treated differently because of the color of their skin, and he realized that was not the case. Now, I would ask you to remember the Crisis because this gives the African American community a place to read about their particular plight. And it also comes under the broad rubric of political commentary, which is at the top of the page. And there are a number of other publications which deal with this. For instance, we dealt briefly with social issues the other day and individuals who were involved in the women's suffrage movement, aka giving women the right to vote. Directly underneath, at the bottom of the page, we have something called muckraker. Now, a muckraker, for lack of a better term, was someone who wrote for a magazine in the late 1890s or early 1900s who was an investigative journalist. Now, I mentioned the other day about the yellow journalism tradition between William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, and how it was ironic that the Pulitzer Prizes were named for somebody who was a yellow journalist. In the case of muckraking, there are a number of things that you need to know. First of all is the name of the publication, which really founded the idea of investigative journalism as we know it today. And that's McClure's Magazine. And for those of you who don't have your books, it's at the bottom of page 69. There are three individuals, two of which are highlighted in the text, one of whom is not, that I want to mention briefly. And I'll mention the first two briefly because you can look in your books about them. The first one is listed on page 72, and her name is Ida Tarbell. She did an in-depth investigation of Standard Oil, which in 1900 was like the Microsoft of 2000. It dominated the oil and gas industry. And by the way, that's not saying that Bill Gates is a bad guy. He's an entrepreneur, and you can legitimately say that he and his wife have probably given as much or more money to charitable foundations than anyone in the history of this country. When you can give out $30 or $40 billion for free computers, that might be a little bit different than John D. Rockefeller throwing kids dimes during the Depression. So, even though a dime, you could get a meal with a dime back then. Anyway, the three people that I would ask you to look at, then we'll go back to the graphics that is on the in-between page, is Tarbell, who investigated John D. Rockefeller, and you can read that. I'm not going to talk about it. The second person is mentioned very briefly on page 73, and his name is Lincoln. First name is Lincoln, just like the president. And his last name is spelled S-T-E-F-F-E-N-S. S-T-E-F-F-E-N-S. Lincoln Stephens. His muckraking dealt with urban corruption, political corruption. Our standard of journalism today is much different than it was then. The types of urban corruption or political corruption that they had then would be more easily found out today because there are more venues with the internet, with television, with radio. But back in these days, it was a totally different animal, the style of journalism that was being practiced. The third person, and by the way, Stephens is mentioned in the text. The third person is not listed in the chapter, so please write this down. His book is probably in the library. The gentleman's first name is Upton, U-P-T-O-N, and his last name is Sinclair, S-I-N-C-L-A-I-R, Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair was an unintended muckraker. He wrote a book called The Jungle. Some of you may have read it in a literature class in high school. Some of you may have read it in junior college or now at SAU. The Jungle, when it was written in the early 1900s, was not designed as a tool of muckraking. It was designed to foster socialism. That's what it was designed to do. But there are about 20 to 30 pages in Upton Sinclair's book that really dominated. By the way, and I had to read this book when I was in high school, and when you get to the end, it's almost like a charge that we must all march towards the socialist revolution in this country. Saying the rhetoric gets a little boring at the end. But the part that I was interested in, just like everyone else, are the 20 to 30 pages where he talks about conditions in meat packing plants. Now, it got so bad. By the way, this is based on real life experiences. He or someone he knew witnessed this which I believe is in the book, where at the meatpacking plants, there was not necessarily such a thing as refrigeration. The diseased animal or the worst meat, and by the way, this goes on today too. I don't mean in truth it does. In someone's mind, if you eat a piece of sausage or you eat a hot dog, you think that's the worst part of the animal, and that's not the case. But back in those days, if you ate a piece of sausage, Lord only knows where that came from. Now, one of the things that is documented in the book is that in the meatpacking plant, they are stirring up large vats of lard. Someone boiling vats of lard. Someone is leaning over, trying to get this to a certain consistency, and it's boiling. And the person falls over and literally disintegrates into the lard. Did they stop the production line? No. So that person went out in tubs of lard.
Oh, God.
Now, Upton Sinclair, as a result of this book, there were a number of changes to the way in which meatpacking plants were put together by President Teddy Roosevelt. Upton Sinclair said, because this was really a diatribe on socialism, he said, I wanted this book to really hit people in the head, and I wound up hitting them in the stomach. So he was an unintended muckraker. But in the long run, now we have, to a certain degree, the Food and Drug Administration. We have a number of things that we didn't have before as a result of that. Next, you'll notice on 73 they talk about the Time Life empire, so I'm not going to get into that. They talk about Harold Ross and the New Yorker. I think what I would ask you to remember about the New Yorker is that this was, for lack of a better term, a witty publication, and it continues today. The writers of the New Yorker, back in those days, had something which was almost analogous to a professor getting tenure, being that you literally had a job there for the rest of your life if you wanted it. I believe they used the term wit crackers because they were just so humorous. Now you see on page 74 the gentleman I was talking about, who has been in journalism for so long, and that's John Johnson, who started Ebony in 1945, and that's his daughter, who is, I believe, the CEO now. But if you take a look at Ebony, the Ebony magazine, the yellow Ebony magazine on the bottom, the one that has 50 on it, and then in the yellow, if you'll notice the way that the Ebony logo is put together, that is very similar to what Life magazine was like. And Life magazine had competition in terms of photojournalism, where Time would be more of a traditional journalistic publication, and Life was primarily photojournalism. There was also a publication called Look, which I recall my mother subscribing to as a knockoff of Life. Page 75. Know the difference between a consumer magazine. If you have your books, follow along here. Just underline them. You can get them, turn these back in at this method about 150, so go ahead and write them. Know the difference between a consumer magazine, which is what all of you were talking about here, a trade, a technical, or a professional magazine. You'll notice here they talk about veterinary practice management, for instance, would be a trade, technical, or professional magazine. The American Medical News would be another one. And here's the last sentence. Pardon me for reading directly. I don't like to do that. Most trade, technical, and professional magazines carry advertising directed at the professions they serve. And I would go one step further. I remember a couple of years ago, I took my wife to the doctor in El Dorado. In fact, I missed a day of the summer speech class in early June because I took her to the doctor in Little Rock, and I noticed this on both occasions, that if you go to a doctor's office, not only will you find these specialized publications, I just can't read a publication, I have to analyze it 5 ways to Sunday, but they also have traditional publications like we would get on a subscription basis. The only difference being the advertising inside is specifically geared to those who would come to a doctor's office. For instance, if you need something like Vioxx or any of the new types of medical treatments or medications, those are specifically geared for people who are in that office. Now, this particular office, They were dealing with people who had back or spine injuries. My wife was in a motorcycle accident in the early 70s, and she has problems with it still. There were kids who were coming into that office, that doctor's office, who were in wheelchairs. Some of them had deformities, and some of the advertisements that you would see in the magazine were geared towards parents of children who had certain types of deformities, special types of wheelchairs. I remember seeing this one little girl who couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old. She really didn't have legs, and she was tooling around in a motorized wheelchair. And sure enough, I looked through one of these publications, and you can see what some, not necessarily what the prices are, but the models are for different types of motorized wheelchairs. So a trade, a technical, or a professional magazine can stretch the boundary to include traditional magazines that have specialized advertisements in them. And then finally, at the bottom here, we have company magazines that are produced by businesses for their employees or customers or stockholders. Now, there are about 4 or 5 pages left in the chapter. They talk about what some of the traditional roles are for magazines in terms of editorial and advertising. And there are a couple of graphs that I want you to know. Here on 76 is one, and then we'll go back. The figure on the bottom of 76 that says where the revenue dollar goes. You see where 32 cents of every dollar is for circulation, 36 cents of every dollar is for manufacturing and distribution, and then the rest is taken up with editorial, pre-tax profit, advertising and promotion, and administrative and other expenses. And of course, advertising and promotion would tie into one of my favorites, the flowing card. Go back now to page 70. There is a graphic here that talks about where the magazine revenue dollar comes from. They have advertising, subscriptions, and single copy sales. So if you ever look at a magazine and wonder how they make their money, go back to this pie chart and you'll see that 47 cents of the dollar comes from advertising, 39 cents from subscriptions, and 14 cents from single copy sales. So 53 cents out of every dollar is going to come from subscriptions or single copy sales. Single copy sales can be quite extreme in the cost. You also have here on the left-hand page, it says more than 11,000 periodicals are published in the United States. I don't know if this is still true, so I'm not going to put it on an exam. But as of a year ago or a couple of years ago, one of the most popular publications was not necessarily Time or Newsweek or Playboy or anything like that. It was Modern Maturity. Now, does anybody know what I'm referring to when I say Modern Maturity? And again, I'm not going to put that on the exam because that might not be accurate today, but as a couple of years ago it was. Modern maturity, of course, is something that most of you probably wouldn't know or wouldn't recognize unless you had grandparents who subscribed to the publication, or if they were members of the AARP, which is the American Association of Retired Persons. And that's the magazine that comes out. So that's why you have more and more publications, more and more television programs, more and more areas in the media catered to people like me who can see the bottom of the hill closer and closer every day because there are more and more older people. And that's, you go where the money is, and older people have a sizable amount of revenue available to them. Okay, go to 78. If you take a look at the course outline section for today on the interactive syllabus, one of the things I mentioned, and I think it's in the last sentence, I wrote the element of web zines. And I don't know if they even talk about this in the back half of the chapter or not, but W-E-B-Z-I-N-E-S, a web zine. The reason that a web zine would become popular is because it gives you many of the elements of a magazine, but you can produce it. Many of my followers going fast. Many of these publications can be produced online at a relative inexpensive cost. Now, let me give you an example. A few years ago, and write this term down, S-L-A-T, slate. I don't think it's in your information. So some of the exam comes from the text, some of it comes from my own doodle, and some of it comes from the videotape. But Slate magazine is a production of Microsoft. It is a political publication. Let me explain to you briefly why a webzine is more practical. Slate, the online magazine, has been out for about 3 years now. Here's how they started. They started out offering the publication free to anyone on the internet. Then they changed it, like the Wall Street Journal in newspapers. You had to have a subscription to actually read the publication. Well, here's the problem. There is a lot of political commentary on the World Wide Web. Why should I have to pay for an online webzine when I can get all different types of political commentary free, which is what the fine folks at Slate figured out? Now, they started out, point one, everybody gets it free. Point two, you have to pay. Now, point three, it's available to all of you free. A lot of webzines have been successful, and at the same time, because it's so competitive, to be very successful, you can't necessarily have a lot of people on staff. Because how are you going to make money with a webzine or any type of publication on the web if you get it free? Advertising. And we are still in the early phases of trying to figure out how many people look at what when. Now, if I wanted to figure out how many people were watching a television program, what would those ratings be called? Exactly. Write this term down. Media. This is also not in your hymnal. Media metrics. M-E-T-R-I-X. Media metrics. This is one of the first legitimate online methods to track who is reading what and for how long. So media metrics right now would be analogous to the Nielsen ratings on television. Except one could argue that media metrics is more accurate because it tracks everything. Whereas if we have Nielsen ratings for Arbitron, what do they do? Just like a political poll, it's a selected random sample. So it's pretty close to being accurate, but it's not checking everybody. So know what a webzine is, know about Slate, and then in the rest of the chapter, and I'll go through this real quick because it's 11:50. On 80 and 81, there are three particular areas that you should probably circle in the Technology in the Future section. On page 80, the first section starts with online magazines, expanding magazine readership. So just circle that dot.